Hey everyone, so in today's video I'm going to show you a range of motion strategy for wrist extension using a very specific setup that allows us to get truer sagittal plane motion of the wrist into extension and simultaneously get some load into the wrist and finger flexors. The main difference here is that we're going to be using more of a hand dominant strategy where we're keeping the forearm fixed in place and we can move the hand relative to the forearm compared to one of the wall-based strategies that we showed you in previous videos where we can position our hand against the wall and we can move our forearm and our body around the hand. The only difficulty, of course, with this variation here is that it can be very good to, for example, to build contractile tolerance at the end range of wrist extension. But if we're trying to gradually expand wrist extension range of motion, it's quite challenging because again, if I don't have that wrist extension range of motion, I'm not going to be able to get my forearm perpendicular to the wall. It's going to be positioned forward so that I'm in less wrist extension, and then I'm going to have to gradually shift my body back relative to the wrist and hand. So it can be difficult in that scenario then to get that more constrained mindful contraction, a controlled contraction into the wrist and finger flexors, because often when you're here, for example, you just can't really get that push into the wall because there's not really much load going onto the wrist and hand. And so what we have to do then in that scenario is we have to use more of a hand dominant strategy where the hand is the prime mover and everything else stays fixed. Okay, whereas in this wall strategy, the hand is staying fixed and the body is moving around the hand. So really simple setup here is to get into a seated position. This is one of many options. But the seated position here allows us to give the client the opportunity to get frequent exposures of this throughout the day. And so what I like to do with clients is, I'll show you from the side here. In a seated position where the thighs are parallel to the ground, I will internally rotate my shoulder and I'll supinate my forearm to position the back of the forearm here, the distal forearm here, over the top of my thigh. And that gives me room then to move the wrist from a neutral position here to wrist extension. Okay, and it again gives me the opportunity then to have some kind of stability of the forearm against the thigh here as I'm putting force via the wrist and finger flexors. Okay. Remember in previous videos we've discussed some of the anatomical and biomechanical considerations around the forearm here, and that is one, when you are extending the wrist in a pronated position, naturally what you're going to get is some radial deviation. So if you were to pronate the forearm now as much as you can and then you try to extend the wrist, what you're going to see is that the second knuckle leads the way. Okay, so that's going to essentially create a combination of wrist extension and radial deviation. It's called a dart thrower's arc or dart thrower's motion. Okay, so of course you're going to get some radial deviation there in that scenario. Now we have also showed in previous videos where we can almost use that pronation range of motion as a way to challenge that wrist extension. But if we want to facilitate more true sagittal plane wrist extension, we want to do it when the forearm is in more of a supinated position. So we want to have the forearm fully supinated in this position here, and the key part of the other hand that is going to provide the resistance or the fixed point that we're going to actually flex the wrist and fingers into is going to be the heel of this hand here. I've just found it becomes a bit awkward when you have the other hand over the top here, because then you're essentially trying to flex this wrist into the other flexing wrist, and it doesn't really enable the client to hold this for longer durations. So use the heel of the hand here, and so it's not really about getting the fingers wide here. We're keeping the fingers pretty much together to make it easier for us to get that contact of the heel of the hand over top the fingers. So I'll use this in clients with post-surgical situations where they are really struggling to bend the wrist beyond neutral, because we can simply get into this position here. We can passively move them back to their tolerated position and then contract either through the fingers or through the metacarpal heads here, and the client feels very safe, and we can gradually perform contract relax technique here in this position where we're contracting for however long you want, 5 to 10 seconds, gradually shift more, 5 to 10 seconds, gradually shift more, and you can increase the duration from there then, for example, okay? So again, heel of the hand on the metacarpal heads if you want to drive just pure wrist flexion, hands on the heel of the hand on the fingers if you want to drive wrist and finger flexion together. You're typically going to feel a bit more load across the forearm when you do that because you're just lengthening the moment arm there, okay? But I do like this, again, particularly when I'm trying to expand wrist extension range of motion in clients that are not able to tolerate. That's another kind of key difference here with this scenario, is that with the wall bias strategy or any kind of strategy where you're weight bearing, you're getting axial force through the wrist, and sometimes that is the stressor or the low profile that is sensitizing the client. They may have a limitation in wrist extension range of motion in an open chain manner, but then when you combine that with axial load, that's when pain really comes on. And so maybe one initial goal of your early rehab at least would be to expand wrist extension range of motion where axial load and that compressive force isn't part of the exercise strategy being used. And so expand that range of motion, and then we can progress into more of a weight-bearing axial load strategy, okay? And so just to show you that setup there again, very simple setup, but it's more about why you're setting it up in this way. So of course you're supinating the forearm to allow us to get that more clean, true sagittal plane wrist extension. And then very often when you are trying to expand range of motion, you are taking the client up to their barrier. That could be just a restriction, that could be a painful barrier, in which case if it's painful and the client has poor contractile tolerance across these muscular tissues, then we may want to come short of that barrier, maybe 10, 20 degrees sometimes, and build some tolerance through the muscular tissues there initially. Let's say we do that for 10, 20 seconds, and then we try to push further into that barrier to try and nudge it even further into the direction of limitation. But let's say it's still very sensitive. Then in that case, what we may want to do is just work on expanding the duration of the contraction first, short of that barrier, before starting to push further into that direction of limitation, past that painful barrier, okay? You have the option again of putting heel of the hand across the metacarpal heads or heel of the hand across the fingers. So it looks like this. So let's say my painful barrier is here. I come just short of that, put the heel of my hand across the metacarpal heads, and I'm building pressure through the metacarpal heads into the heel of the hand here. And I'm just holding that for time. I can of course be more mindful as to the intensity of the contraction. Typically I'll have clients start with 30-40% of their max, I just say 30% of your max strength, and that's 100% of your contraction. We want to stay there. Again, the thumb is just floating in this position here. And then of course after that contraction we can see, can we go further into that direction of limitation, and then we can contract again and progress from there. When we are pushing through the fingers, what we're going to do is get the heel of the hand over top the distal part of the fingers, not over the tips, but across the kind of almost the halfway point of the fingers here. Heel of the hand there, get into the restricted barrier, come just short of that, and then push. And if you try this yourself now, what you'll typically feel is a bigger experience of contraction across the anterior forearm here, because again you're just lengthening the moment arm. And we can hold that for time and then gradually progress from there. But you can see the simplicity of the setup here. Now what you can also do here, particularly in clients that have wrist and hand issues, forearm issues, is you can of course start to bend the fingers back even further to try and couple that wrist extension with finger flexion as well, and then crush into the heel of your hand again. So it may look something like this. I think hopefully you can see it from there, but I'm positioning the wrist into end range wrist extension and then going further underneath my thigh to really push the fingers underneath the thigh and then contracting the fingers into my hand. And you'll typically feel a much stronger sensation of stretch and contraction even across the palm of the hand as well. If you deal with any client that does a lot of gripping, pulling kind of activity for their occupation, then oftentimes you might find those clients actually have an inability to extend the wrist or extend the fingers beyond neutral, because they actually have quite a bit of restriction across the palm of the hand, and that may be reflected into the forearm as well. You can also do that without the wrist extension component, where you just have the back of the hand on the top of the thigh, and then you are trying to extend the fingers here and then push the fingers into the heel of the hand there again. So you can see I'm opening up everything across the palm of the hand here. And again, that can be very helpful, again, like I said, in those clients that have wrist and hand issues, but they lack the ability to extend the fingers relative to the hand, okay? And so we could start there. You'll typically feel that across the anterior hand, and then we can start to couple that then with wrist extension and finger extension, but contracting via the finger flexors and wrist flexors here, okay? Again, the simplicity here, like I said, is the fact that we can get that nice clean sagittal plane wrist extension here when in forearm supination. It becomes much more challenging when you are in more of a pronated forearm position. It's not that it's not doable, it's just that you're getting some deviation of the wrist into the radial direction with that. Again, that might be fine. That might be something you want to do, even with certain clients as well. But if you're making it your goal to try and expand wrist extension range of motion, then I think it's important to at least try and get that clean sagittal plane wrist extension range of motion first, in which case you have to put the forearm in a supinated position, expand that, build contractile tolerance in that position towards the end range, and then we can start to add more demand, more load on top of that then by moving into the wall. And then there's other ways we can add more speed, and there of course may be other directions of limitation and contractile limitations that we need to focus on as well. But the main focus of this video was to just show you the simple setup. Again, very convenient for clients to do. They get that frequent exposure across the day. They've no excuses really in this position here. Sometimes clients will tell you that they don't have wall space to do this on, but when you just need your own body, and you're using your body as a way to create that platform upon which you can create that wrist extension, then it's just very, very convenient for the clients to get that repeated exposure across the day. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful, that you can use with your wrist and hand clients. And of course, like always, if you have any questions, please let us know below.